Good evening, everyone. And it's great to be giving this talk on the Spanish Civil War because, as Linda says, this is has been my major research area um, for the last, 30 odd years, really, I suppose. Um, so thank you. This session then looks at Spain in the period of 36 to 39. So the aims of this session then is to talk about how we might understand the causes and the nature of the Civil War. I've called it the Revolution Civil War. I'll explain that because it's very often not referred to as a revolution and civil war. But as we'll see, I think it's very important to talk about the fact that there was indeed a revolution going on through part of the period of the Civil War. I also want to talk a little bit about the nature of the war and the revolution, both political and military terms. I'm not a military historian, but I'm quite happy to answer questions on military aspects. I will say something about the nature of the conflict. I wanted to talk about why the nationalists, which is Franco's side, why they ultimately won in April 1939, and to say a little bit about some of the historical controversies that surround the writing of the history of the Spanish Civil War, and also a little bit about the international ramifications of the war. But what I will very strongly say, I think, is that this was Spain's war. Some historians like to present it as a kind of world war in miniature. That's a quote from someone I can't remember who, going a long way back. And in some respects it was, but really it was a war that came out of Spain's particular modern history. And I'll say something about that. So I'm going to start by thinking about some of the big questions. You know, why did a partially successful rising by sections of Spain's military and radical right-wing parties, including the fascist party, the Falange Española, but also other organizations, including the Carlists. Why did it develop into a prolonged conflict which had international ramifications? Um, Also, can we talk about a revolution and counter-revolution in Spain? What caused that? And how did it affect the situation of the war? Because it clearly did. And how would we assess the conduct of the war? I think most people are aware that the Spanish Civil War included terrible atrocities. The one that people know most about, probably, or are most familiar with, is Guernica in the spring of 1937, the bombing of the Basque town. Um, but there were many other atrocities, and I'll just very briefly, very briefly, address what Paul Preston has referred to in a recent book as the Spanish Holocaust. Um, Also, say something about the international aspects because it was one of the crises of the mid 1930s, along with the war in Abyssinia, the reoccupation, remilitarization of the Rhineland, and various other crises of the mid 1930s. And ultimately, why did the Republic lose? So these are huge questions. We can really only skim the surface, I think. Um, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the background to the war. The war broke out in July 1936, um, across a number of days from the 17th to the 21st of July 1936, because it took time to develop in different parts of Spain and also in Spanish Morocco. Um, I will say a little bit about the causes of the war. The term uneven combined development really refers to the fact that Spain was a very backward country. It was a country with capitalist development, mainly in the Basque Country and in Catalonia, although there were pockets of industrialization, mining, and a few pockets of what could be described as capitalist agriculture. But the vast majority of Spain, I'm sure everyone's very aware, it's a very rural country with huge landed estates, particularly in the south of Spain. with a mass of landless workers who were not really peasants, but they were day laborers. They could be described as day laborers. There were peasants in Spain. Spain's, and it would be a whole session to talk about the immense complexities of Spain's demography. But suffice it to say that it was a country with a kind of contradictory development, both modern, quite modern in places. If you went to Barcelona or Madrid, you'd see very modern cities by the 1930s. Also Bilbao as well. But as soon as you step out into the countryside, it's almost as if you would step back centuries, really, to very to relations of production, as Marx would call it, between workers and bosses that had been unchanged for a very long time. Um, Spain had been through a great deal of turmoil in the 19th century. I think I counted 54 revolutions and palace coups in the 19th century. Um, but there was a final sort of dictatorship prior to the period we're talking about in the 1920s, where the governor, military governor of Catalonia decided to take power. That was Primo de Rivera. But anyway, he was out of the picture by the early 30s, and there was a brief democratic Second Republic, which again, we haven't really got time to do justice to. But it did bring in reforms, particularly it tried to bring in some land reforms, also educational reforms, progressive reforms. It was what could be described in the jargon of the time by the left as a bourgeois democratic republic, which is to say a capitalist republic run by a sort of liberal left government. It wasn't, it was a government in which socialists were certainly supportive of, but the mainstay were Republicans, particularly in the first couple of years of the Republic. There was then a great deal of political conflict. Um, it's the period, if you think of the early 1930s, the period of the rise of fascism, already fascism in Italy, the rise of fascism in Germany, and similar movements in many other parts of Europe. In Spain, you also had the development of a fascist movement, the Falange Española, which modelled itself on Mussolini's black shirts. But there were many other groups as well, including highly conservative landed interests who wanted to keep things just as they were. Also industrial interests, particularly in the mining industries in the Basque Country and a few other places, Asturias as well, and also the textile industry in Catalonia, and various other more modern industries that had emerged in recent decades. Spain was therefore caught between this idea of progress and the massive weight of its rural backwardness, which threw up all sorts of conflicts and tensions within society. The military had played a big part in Spain's modern history, and they saw themselves as a group, really, in a way, a kind of interest group that should not be excluded. So they'd waged a number of different coups, revolts in the 19th century. The last one, as I've said, was 1923, and they would be main players when it comes to the rising of July 1936. There's also the context of the global economic depression, which hit Spain pretty badly. Um, uh, it wasn't a strong economy to start with, and the contraction of global demand, world demand for Spanish goods. Spain needed to export goods, really, particularly mineral products, but also textiles from the Catalan textile industry. It led to quite high periods of unemployment. And Spain's labour force was very, very prone to periods of instability. The thing about Spain, though, is another factor about Spain, which adds to this uneven and combined development idea, was that despite its backwardness, it actually had quite a well developed labour movement. This labour movement was split into different factions. It had a big socialist party. The UGT was a trade union. The PSOE, the same political party as today in Spain, the Socialist Party. Um, they were pretty substantial, but they had Spain had sort of twin pillars of its labor movement because it unusually had an anarcho-syndicalist movement, the CNT, the Red and Black. They were anarchists, but they were also had the tactic of syndicalism, which meant they wanted the big general strike, which would bring about the revolution, they thought. The Communist Party was tiny in Spain, and really tiny in Spain by the 1930s, but they had other dissident communist groups who were anti-Stalinist groups, sometimes wrongly referred to as Trotskyists. They weren't really Trotskyists. Um, they weren't really Trotskyists, but they were influenced by Trotsky in political terms. This has been the area of my own research, so I'm going to try not to say too much about that, so to get too not to get too much off track. But I will be mentioning them. Their major political party by 1936 was a party called the POUM, the POUM. If you're familiar with George Orwell's Homage to Catalonia, that's the party. He didn't join it actually, but he fought with the POUM militia in Aragon, in fact, on the Aragon front. And if you're familiar with Ken Loach's Land and Freedom, the film, 1996, then that is the organization that is central to that particular film about the Civil War. So I'll talk a little bit about that, but again, I don't want to get too sidetracked into perhaps some of the micropolitics of Spain because it is incredibly complex. I'll say something about both left and right as we go on. So, key events in up to 1936, the loss of Spain's remaining colonies in 1898. There's a great In Our Time about that a few weeks ago, which you might want to check out with Mary Vincent talking about that. Then all sorts of conflicts. The church, very big in Spain. A lot of anti-clericalism in Spain. Tragic week was a week of unrest in 1909. The dictatorship I mentioned in the 20s, and then finally the end of Spain's monarchy and the beginning of a short-lived republic. Republic lasted 1931 to 1939, although of course part of that's the Civil War from 36 to 39. Other crises during its period, attempts at reform, resistance to the reform from landowners, from the military, from the church, from industrialists as well to some extent. They even had a little revolution in Asturias, in the miners of Asturias in 1934, which was suppressed with great brutality by Francisco Franco, the young general who'd made his name in Spanish Morocco in the imperial exploits there and was very much a rising star of the military, but also somebody who was very well versed in extreme brutality, as he showed in 1934 in Asturias. Okay, so that takes us through to to 36 and the events in 36. Do be aware I'm leaping over many things here in order to to give you a background. The Popular Front government was a array of left-wing and centre Republican parties that came to power in an election in February 1936. It was accompanied, as the French Popular Front was, by a great deal of optimism about change. People wanted land. These land workers wanted, to occupy land, but because they were land workers, not really peasants, they had a very collective idea about what they should do with the land. This is tremendously important. And so they tended to take over landed estates and occupy them, and they wanted to essentially to run them collectively. That wasn't true all over Spain, but it was particularly true in the big latifundia of central and southern Spain, Andalusia in particular, of course. There was lots of violence between fascist groups. There was a kind of sort of war, civil war brewing through the spring of 1936, and always rumors of a military conspiracy. But then in Spain, there were always rumors of a military conspiracy, if you like. But some of the parties of the right joined the conspiracy. Again, the left and the right are incredibly complex when we start to look at them, and there's all sorts of factors which I'm not going to go into. Who were the Carlists? You might want to ask me that at the end. But they were one of the groups of the right. Then there's a general strike in May, builders' strike in June. The Madrid building workers were the center of the socialist trade unions, the UGT. The assassination of a political figure, a member of the Calvo Sotelo. Which triggered a response from the military. He was pretty much a fascist, really, Calvo Sotelo, and he was assassinated in Madrid. It was the end of a whole tit for tat spate of assassinations of left and right. And that triggered the military rising that started in Morocco, and in which Franco was an important part, but not actually the leader of the rising. Again, there isn't really time to tell you how Franco got to be the generalissimo, the top general. Um, it involved all sorts of things, but he did by September 1936. But initially, he's just one of the generals who decides who participates in the rising. There's a whole history around Franco, and if you want to read the great biography of Franco, Paul Preston's biography is really superb. And very funny as well. Although Franco was not a funny man, but there's his biography is brilliant actually. And then you get a series of risings in mainland Spain. I've got maps. You have to do this with maps, I think. But I'll just briefly say a little bit more about the politics of the Republican side. The term Republican side is a bit problematic, as we'll see. However, here you see the panoply of political groups: the socialists, the anarchists. I should call them anarcho-syndicalists, really. The Republicans, centre Republicans, sort of a little bit, well, they're liberal Republicans. That's what they were. They want reforms. Then there's the nationalists, the Basque nationalists. They're not left wing. They're actually quite conservative. But the Republic has promised that eventually the Basque country will become semi-autonomous. It hasn't been yet, hasn't become so yet. The Catalan nationalists also, they've been promised something very similar. And in fact, they already have their own little government, the Generalitat. The Generalitat, which is their Catalan government, that exists already by this point. One of the first decrees of the Republican government after the the civil war breaks out, is to give the Basques regional autonomy as well, meaning that the Basques will stay on side, despite the fact they're actually quite conservative. Then there's the official communists, the PCE, they're tiny, and the dissident communists of the POUM, POUM, that's the Workers' Party of Marxist Unification, led by Andres Nin. They are bigger, much bigger than the official communists, but they're mainly Catalan. You're beginning to see some of the complexities of this, I think, already. One could go on. There are many, many, many other groups. On the nationalist side, this is the Franco side, the nationalist Franco side. They've got lots of different parties and organizations. The Falange, the Alphonsine monarchists, the Carlists, they're a different type of monarchists. I told you it was complicated. Spain never has one of anything. They always have two or more. And in Spain, there are two Carlist organizations, but they are on the right. The military, the majority of them, particularly the officer corps, they are very much at the center of the rising. The church hierarchy, very, very much focused on supporting Franco, etc. And then large and medium-sized landowners, the financial interests, and many industrialists. So you can see the the polarization in Spain was really very, very stark indeed. All those groups who had been sort of playing with the democratic system up until now have abandoned it in the spring of 1936, and now they're committed to some kind of military rising. I think there's still somebody unmuted, actually. It's Anne. I think you're unmuted, Anne. You want to just mute yourself. Thank you. Um, so the war. Say something about the war. Backdrop is Guernica, of course, behind. Um, start off. I've got three maps here. The first map shows you the division of Spain up to July 36. Um, I think you're also unmuted, Linda. You might want to just mute yourself there. So here you can see the division of Spain. This is the point at which the military has risen. There isn't time to talk about all the details of that, but you can see that the light grey is the Republican zones. These are the zones that resist the military. The dark zones are the zones where the military managed to take power and make advances early on in the Civil War. So the northwest up here, and then across to Burgos will become their capital during the nationalist capital during the war. And then down that finger of territory there from Algeciras going up into Andalusia, up to Seville, that is where Franco's Army of Africa, they get an airlift. And this is where the international issues come in, because the Germans and the Italians offer them planes to transport Spanish regular troops across to Andalusia. And that's Franco pushing up. And they're all aiming towards Madrid. The deal is this: if you can take Madrid, the capital, then you win, essentially. And one of the reasons why the Civil War lasted so long, for 3 years, was because they couldn't take Madrid. Although the government of the Republican government didn't have great confidence that Madrid was not going to fall, and they very soon moved their government to Valencia. But Madrid held out almost till the end, actually, which is an extraordinary thing. And there is a whole session one could do on the defense of Madrid, which is extraordinary. Um, One thing to say here is why was there resistance? Well, as soon as the military rose up and tried to take control in the major cities, the workers' movements, and they were, as I've said, there were several of them. They formed militias. Many of the police actually stayed loyal to the government, and some of the army stayed loyal to the government, but not most of it. The Air Force, they also, quite a lot of them stayed loyal to the government, and also the Navy, quite a lot of Spain's Navy. That meant that it was not possible at that time for the nationalists, Franco's side, to cross the Straits of Gibraltar. So they needed an air transports, and that's what they got. So it's courtesy of the Germans and the Italians that the Army of Africa, which was the only fully professional force in the Spanish army, many of them were Moroccans, led by Francisco Franco, who'd made his name there and who was actually military governor down in the Canary Islands at the time. He nips across to Spanish Morocco, leads his forces across, and they start to move towards Madrid. Up in the north, it's far less well organized. If you want a short answer as to why does Franco become the major general, his rivals die in various ways, including in plane crashes, two in plane crashes, or they're captured by the Republicans. And the main reason is because he's got the best army. That's the main reason. Anyway, this is the period then in the early days of the Civil War. So you've got militia groups forming, taking control of these cities, supporting the Republican government broadly. But the other thing they do is there's the beginning of a revolution where the left wing, the radical groups of the anarcho-syndicalists and also the PUM, the dissident communists, they decide they want to actually try to push through a social revolution. So in those areas, they start to collectivize the land, they collectivize transport, they collectivize factories. It is a varied picture, though, in different places, but it's most significant in Catalonia and also in parts of Andalusia, where they take over landed estates and create collective farms, if you like, or collective entities there. That's the essence of the revolution, which we'll come back to. Um, there's much more to be said about it. So the shape of the war then, through to May 1937, the first phase of the war. The nationalists take about a third of Spain. General Mola is the initial head of the rising after the death of General Sanjurjo, who dies in a plane crash in Portugal. Mola later will die in a plane crash himself, which will sort of, seal Franco's leadership. He was already leader by that time, actually. So there's the bit about the Moroccan troops coming across, which is critical. Um, the Republic holds on to territory quite well. From September, Stalin starts to send aircraft and other support technicians and advisors to the Republic. He didn't want to. He does it because Hitler and Mussolini are supporting the nationalists. But he does send, and they prove to be quite important. The other thing that's critical in defense of Madrid, which again there isn't really time to talk about, is the organization of the international brigades. Probably again one of the best known aspects of this, organized by the communist parties, particularly in France, and Paris becomes a kind of conduit for international brigaders. But eventually, about 53 countries, people from 53 countries, come to Spain to fight fascism. I've got more on that a bit later on. Um, Hitler sends an air squadron, well, more than a squadron actually, an air force, the Condor Legion. And it's the Condor Legion and some Italians who bombed Guernica in April 1937. The Aragon front over on to the sort of the west of the Basque Country becomes a focus for attacks to try to counterattack nationalist forces in the north. By early 1937, the Republic has finally formed a popular army, which is an attempt to fuse all the militias together and create a single army, which is a good idea. Which is a good idea. And the international brigades fight very, very bravely in the defense of Madrid, losing huge numbers. The Americans lose about a third of people killed. That's a very high kill rate in any war, to lose a third of your force. And as you can see, a lot of quite famous people, including Julian Bell, are killed on the Brunete front. The international brigade aspect is a whole other aspect, which I'll touch on, but there isn't really time to talk about. The defense of Madrid, here's a couple of posters here. Is this slogan "No pasarán" becomes the great slogan for Madrid. The idea is if you can hold on to Madrid, you're still resisting Franco. Madrid becomes a great focal point, a totem of anti-fascism for all people who are anti-fascist, and they're not just on the left. There are people from the British Conservative Party who go to support the Republic, for example. Lots and lots of people from the centre ground, of course, do. Lots of intellectuals, artists. Well, we've seen Julian Bell as one of them, but many others, of course, will support the cause. And we know that in Britain, a very large chunk of public opinion was very pro-Republican during the Civil War. So, moving on to the next phase of the war, which is that between in 1937 and what's happening here, you can see the nationalists have taken a lot more territory. That finger of territory has gone up to become almost three sides. Madrid is surrounded on three sides. If you're interested in Hemingway's book novel, The For Whom the Bell Tolls, of course he was a journalist in Spain in that period. Something I'm very interested in. It's just to the north here in this area around near Segovia. That's where those guerrilla fighters were fighting. Really, that sort of front line up there, so far as it was a front. And this defense of Madrid was extraordinary. The international brigades, the Italian international brigades, score a great hit against the Italian fascist troops who are sent in. They actually defeat the Italian fascists at Guadalajara. It's a very famous victory. So the early victories, many of them go to the Republic, but the Republic is getting carved up. You can see along the Santander coast here in Bilbao, there's Guernica. Um, that is taken in 1937, a bit later than this map, which loses a big area of industrial zone for the Republic. Um, there's much more to say about the individual conflicts, of course, and battles going on here. Um, I've got another map, but just got a. This takes us through to 1939, to the end of the war. It's April 39, technically the end of the war. Um, when Madrid falls at the end of March, and so here are the balance of forces: about 600,000 for the Nationalists, about 400,000 for the Republic. Um, the Nationalists had better equipment by the middle of the war. The Russian equipment was good in initially, but the nationalists would have much better equipment from the middle of the war onwards. There's lots of political changes within the Republican camp, which we haven't got time to really talk about. Um, but the Republic starts, as it becomes clear the Republic is not going to win militarily, they start to rest their hopes upon the fact there will be a wider war in Europe, and that when that comes, Spain will have an opportunity, therefore, to relieve some of the pressure on it. Um, that's the aim. They don't get there, of course, because the war is they're defeated by April 39. So they're many months short of what they would have needed to get to for that to be the case. But they have a number of very significant attempts to break the nationalists. It is a very, very hard fought contest. But because we're not talking about vast numbers, vast armies, that's why it's fought on different fronts. And many of those fronts, there nothing happens for long periods of time. If you read Orwell's Homage to Catalonia, he says that. He says hardly anything's happening here, which was true at that time, which was certainly true. Anyway, there isn't time to talk about all the battles. I've tried to list these. If anybody wants these slides, by the way, I'm quite happy to email you the slides after this session if you let Linda know. I'm not precious about my slides, so you'd be able to perhaps take in some of the text. I've tried to put in all the most important things into the text here. This is the April 37, the bombing of Guernica, which of course led to Picasso's famous painting, which is extraordinary. 85% of the town destroyed. And it had no real significance. The reason that they destroyed it was to show the Republic that they could, because there were very few anti-aircraft guns. They could bomb from a very low altitude, and that's why they caused so much damage. Other places where there were anti-aircraft guns, they couldn't bomb from quite so low down, and bombs tend to drift. Anyway, there's more that could be said about that, but it is a key image, I think, of the war, and of course, Picasso's painting becomes crucial propaganda for the Republic. Here's the division in 38. Um, Here's the point of this map is to show the point at which Republican territory is bisected by the nationalists who hit the coast at Castellón, and this is by July 38. Um, by this point, really, the writing's on the wall. The International Brigade actually will leave a few months later because it's clear that the war is not going to be won. Um, I've just sort of tried to sum up some of the forces in terms of the foreign intervention here, because people often ask about this. German forces, you can see them there. I'm not going to go through all of them, but the volunteers, the international brigades, much heavy, more heavily. I mean, several thousand volunteers on the Republican side. Um, in a sense, we don't have absolute figures for this, but I've just given a few figures of this. It could well be that that these figures are conservative figures actually, but certainly we're talking about 5 or 6 thousand at least in total. In fact, I think I've got some. Yeah, sorry, 35,000. Well, I'm talking about 35,000. That's what I meant, of the international brigades, and then there's all the other people who came, field hospitals. You know, this is a breakdown of the international brigades. You can see even the PULM, which was a small organisation, had quite considerable foreign involvement in that. And these were the revolutionary groups, really, essentially. The rest of the international brigades were tended to be loyal to the official Communist Party. Why is that important? Well, what you have to realise, and this is something that people find it very difficult to understand. But the official Communist Party did not support the revolution. How about that? Stalin did not support the revolution in Spain. Actually, he wanted to suppress it and did a lot to try to suppress it. He sent in his secret police. So you have the NKVD active in Spain, who do murder some of the revolutionary leaders, including the leader of the PULM, Andreas Nin, who is murdered in after May 1937 by Russian agents. Probably also some Spanish communists as well involved in that too. And there are many anarcho-syndicalists who are also murdered, because Stalin's foreign policy was to try and forge an alliance with Britain and France against Germany. Britain and France were having none of it, so Stalin's dream was never materialized until after the German attack on Russia in June 1941. But his aim was to forge an alliance. So he didn't want to be seen as supporting revolution. It's difficult to get your head around that. I know that because it's been the focus of my research. But it's undoubtedly is the case. And there really isn't any other way of seeing that, actually. Some people have tried to defend Stalin's position, but it's really very difficult to. But he was sending aid to the Republic, which gave him a great deal of clout when it came to what happened in the Republic. I'll come back to that in a little bit, actually, and say a little bit more about that. Casualties, we again, these are estimates. 600,000. Is a likely estimate that's given. Um, some suggest up to 1 million because we might include disease and malnutrition. Undoubtedly, a lot of people died from that. There was also, of course, the terrors, both the nationalist terror, which killed at least 150,000 people. It's the subject largely of Paul Preston's book, The Spanish Holocaust. But the Republicans also shot quite a lot of people who were caught, particularly in the early months of the war, and particularly in Madrid or around Madrid. Um, so you can see here figures, maybe 60,000 who were killed on the Republican side. But the thing is that the killings on the nationalist side went on long after the end of the war. And there were possibly 50,000 people killed after the end of the war into the 1940s. It's a whole subject in its own right, of course. Um, I was going to say something a little bit about the revolution. Um, women played a big role in the revolution, actually, as you can see here from this militia woman. Um, that was to change by the May 1937, as we'll see, when the communists managed to establish a pretty firm hold over the organization of the Popular Army, and basically said women can be in the army, but they can be in the army as cooks and nurses. Yeah. Whereas you can see here, this is in Barcelona, in the early days, women actually held guns and they were important parts of the militias. Again, if you want more on that, Land and Freedom deals with that issue quite squarely and very accurately, actually. That's Ken Loach's film. So the summer revolution of 36, you can see I've just tried to summarize it here. Again, it's a complex thing, and it's not uniform. It's happened, different things are happening in different places. But essentially what happens is these militias, where there are radical trade unions like the CNT, that's where you get the most energetic revolutionary activity. You can see, and some of it's joint government and union control as well. There are various decrees that are passed by the Republican government to legalize the collectivization of businesses and estates, land estates. Um, there's also kind of an attempt at a political revolution particularly in Catalonia. But what emerges there, I've put a few quotes. I'm not going to read the quotes, but these are the CNT, the anarcho-syndicalists, who are very radical. They want to do away with money, for example. In fact, they do in some of their collectives. The collectivization, does take place at quite a large extent, more than you might think. But the political revolution never gets to the point of having what was known as dual power, as in Russia in 1917, in October 1917. You never have um, a single revolutionary political party like the Bolsheviks who know what they want to do and who are successful. There are loads of revolutionary parties in Spain, like the PUM, but they never get into the position of a political power. Um, they end up very often joining the Republican government. The PUM joins the Republican government. So later on will the CNT. These are people who don't believe in the state, but they actually join the government. It shows you how complex and confused the whole situation was. Social economic revolution undoubtedly takes place here. I've tried to summarize it as best I can in terms of the collectivization. As you can see, it's very, very much varies in different places, very substantially. Um, you know, and it generally goes furthest where the war is furthest away from. What Orwell experiences in Barcelona in December and early January 1936 and 37, um, is atypical really of what's going on elsewhere. But one of the reasons that he sees the workers in charge is largely because it's a long way from the front line and will be for quite a long time. In Barcelona, in Catalonia, you have this is Luis Companys, who is the leader of the Generalitat, the Catalan government. He's a pretty clever guy, wants regional autonomy, and instead of rejecting the revolutionary organizations, he tries to bring them into the government, which is moderately successful until, well, until May 1937, as we'll see. Here's Orwell in Barcelona in December 36, and he talks about the working class are in the saddle. That does seem to be a fair description of what was happening there, but it is not. It doesn't look like that so much in Madrid. just, or many other big cities actually in the Republican Spain. But it did in Barcelona for a time. But I think there is even within this, a recognition that things were changing, things were going to change, as they did in May 1937. May 1937, where you get what I've called a counter-revolution, which is where the Republicans and the communists, the PSUC is actually the Catalan Communist Party, um, where they get into a conflict with the CNT and the PUM, over control, really, control in this case of the telephone exchange. Um, and fighting breaks out between them. It's finally ended after about a week by the CNT leadership, who've actually joined the government and who call on their workers to desist. But it's the beginning of the end for the revolution, really, because what then happens is a winding up of many of the collectives, the arrest of some of the revolutionaries, including Nin and the leadership of the PUM. They even have a show trial, rather like Moscow, actually, although actually the PUM leaders are exonerated by the judge who says, no, they're anti-fascist too. um, but the socialist prime minister in the Valencia government, Largo Caballero, is forced out. And essentially what happens is the republic becomes very, very squarely bourgeois democratic, with the middle of the road political parties in charge and the communists, the official communists, very much supporting them with Soviet aid, of course. Um, Other factors to talk about, which I haven't talked about yet, is the Non-Intervention Committee set up in London by under Lord Plymouth, suggested by the French but eagerly taken up by the British. Their idea is to try and starve both sides of weapons of war to try to bring about an end to the war. But it's really, as one historian has called it, malevolent neutrality, really, because they give this elected government, the Republican government's elected government, they give it equal status with the leadership of the military rising. The Burgos government, because that's where Franco and his cronies are, and they give them equal status, which is clearly not going to help the Republic, because it's not designed to help the Republic, really. It makes it very difficult for the Republic to buy weapons on the open market. They do buy things, but they transfer their entire gold reserves to Russia. As Stalin says, rather problematically, for safekeeping. They never get them back, by the way. Um, but Stalin makes a point. He says, well, look, we're giving all this aid. You've got to pay for it. It's not given freely. The aid isn't given freely. Whereas Germany and Italy ostensibly give aid freely. Actually, they don't. What Hitler wants is mineral rights in Spain, and it's what he gets, actually. He needs heavy-duty minerals for his wolfram he needs for steel, for high-quality steel production. And Spain is very rich in minerals. Okay, there's lots more one could say about non-intervention committee. It does not help. Was the Republic made to fail? Is one argument. There's no doubt that it was a rising of its own military that overthrows the government, and fights a war against it, um, and the Republic gets very little help from outside apart from Soviet Union and Mexico. They're the only two countries that support the Republic, and of course the international volunteers who go to fight on the side of the Republic. Um, in a way, it's on a hiding to nothing, really, given the fact that Germany and Italy are pumping an awful lot of resources into Franco's arsenal. Um, and ultimately, that will be the balance. Um, was the Republic always untenable? That's one of those questions that I think it's probably impossible to answer. It's a classic what if scenario, isn't it? Very, very hard to say, whether it would have survived, the Second World War. Um, But ultimately, one has to say that it couldn't survive against the array of forces with which it was challenged. Why did the nationalists win? I've tried to summarize this. The effects of foreign intervention were top, really. Economic assistance to the nationalists, the fact that the Republic lost its wheat producing areas fairly quickly. So food became a problem. Malnutrition was a huge issue. Disease was a huge issue. Um, the nationalists were coherent, if you like, politically, economically, militarily, whereas the Republic, as we've seen, were divided. It's difficult to say there was one Republican side because these anarcho-syndicalists, they wanted a revolution. They were fighting a revolution, which the Republican government clearly didn't want. So you've got internal conflicts there. You've got the fact that the non-intervention committee actually makes things worse for the Republic by essentially placing it on an equal footing with the illegal, nationalist rising. And there's also the military failings of the Republican side, strategic mistakes that are made. That's true. So, in conclusion, I'm going to come to an end here. We must say that this was the genesis of this war was Spanish. It does form, though, part of the European crises of the mid 1930s, and it does have an international impact. One of the reasons why Hitler and Mussolini were able to bury many of their differences was because of their cooperation in the Spanish Civil War. It had relatively little impact on British foreign policy. Appeasement, the strategy of appeasement continued on, and there's huge debates about whether that was a good policy, a strong policy, or a weak policy. Um, there's no doubt, though, that you'd have to say this was a failure of the democracies to respond to a major crisis, and I include the Americans in this. Roosevelt refused to get involved, despite the fact that his wife was very keen on America getting involved and supporting the Republic. But Roosevelt felt that that it would get in the way of his New Deal policies in America. There was actually quite a lot of support for the nationalists amongst Republicans in America too. It was an issue, certainly. And there was a huge hostility to getting involved again in European affairs after the First World War, of course. So there are all sorts of reasons why that should be the case. So I'm going to stop there and hand back to Linda. Okay.
For somebody like Franco, who was clearly a nasty piece of work,
Yes.
why did he decree that the monarchy should be reinstated when he died? It's never made
Yeah.
sense to me.
It's a great question. Okay. So Franco was a monarchist. He was also a Catholic, a very strong Catholic and a traditionalist. There's a big debate about whether he qualifies as a fascist. Paul Preston think he does. Lots of other people think not quite. He's something different. But he was a very strong monarchist and believed in the monarchy. And as far as Franco was concerned, he was merely placeholding until until it was the right time to bring the monarchy back. Now, of course, during his lifetime, he never thought it was the right time to bring the monarchy back.
Hmm.
And he had Juan Carlos brought up, educated, partly outside the country, but partly in Spain as well. And he was essentially groomed to be Franco's successor.
Hmm.
Um, and it's a paradox, really, if you like, because he was a monarchist. He believed in monarchy. The thing about Franco was that he always said the civil war is not over. And various things helped him out there. You remember ETA, the Basque nationalist group,
Yeah.
they got involved in attacks from the 1960s. It didn't start as a terrorist organization, but it became one. Um, and that led Franco to be able to say, the war's not over. You still need me.
That was absolutely fascinating. I think this is a subject that you could
Well, yeah.
go on. I mean, like any particular faction, uh,
Mm.
uh, Kay's asking your question and the Carlists.
Yeah, okay, right, the Carlists, yes. So the Carlists, if you look at 19th century Spanish history, you'll see the Carlists there. They had their own claim to the throne. It was a pretty obscure claim, but they had their own claimant, Don Carlos. Don Carlos. But essentially, um, another brand of monarchism known as Alphonsine monarchism was the central one, and in fact, that's the current monarchy in Spain is Alphonsine monarchist. The Carlists were very big in the Basque Country, and they fought a number of wars in the 19th century. Well, they sort of came back in the 1930s, and you can tell them if you see colorized photographs or color photographs. There are a few of the Franco's people, and they wear red berets. They are the Carlists, the ones with the berets. Um, but needless to say that Franco didn't write them off because they were useful to him,
Mm.
but he favoured Alfonso's the 13th's heirs, and that one of those was Juan Carlos. The politics of the Civil War alone are extremely complex. This is usually 20, 25 2-hour sessions. I've tried to boil it down,
Mm.
but you can see that. But you look at the number of books. When I first started researching it, it was estimated there were 60,000 books on the Spanish Civil War. I don't know what that figure would be now.
Alan, thank you very much indeed. You can go
Welcome.
and have a well-deserved drink of whatever is your tipple. Thanks very much indeed, and bye bye for now.
Bye bye.
Bye
Thank you.
bye.